Good morning. Welcome to the Rare Drug Development Symposium. Hi, my name is Arquez Starling. I'm the founder and CEO of Revelis Clinical Services. Revelis is a purposeful technology-enabled clinical research company that is enabling patients with rare and complex diseases to be able to participate in clinical trials in the comfort of their home. I'm excited today to introduce a topic that is certainly near and dear to both myself as well as the panelists. And so looking forward to a very spirited discussion today. On behalf of Global Gene, the Orphan Disease Center, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the session on advances in clinical trial design and real-world evidence in rare disease. Thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us today. Before we kick things off, I want to review a few basic housekeeping items. You'll see that the chat bot to the left of the video allows you to interact with each other, the program staff, and hope you use this opportunity to make some new connections. Please note that links and resources that are not able to be shared via the chat, but if you would like to upload any shared resources for the community, please share those on the social wall. The question box is located on the left of your screen. We encourage you, yes, we encourage you to use the question box to share your questions with the presenters. This is your time to find answers and insights that will help you advance your work as a partner in the rare disease research. Please note that the speakers will not be able to see any of the questions in the chat area, but rather the official question section. If you're not able to address all questions, we will absolutely do our best to try to fill those. If not, we'll follow up directly with you after the presentation. To the right of your video, you'll see a captions and translation. To use either of these, please explain your session and select your language. We'd like to thank a special thank you to Horizon and Greenwich Biosciences for the support of these tools. If you have any questions about the technology or the program, please look for request support button in each session or the live support chat in the bottom right corner of your non-session page. And then last but certainly not least, I do want to acknowledge that the views expressed by the panelists are the views of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official policies and positions of their companies or institution. I encourage all of you to participate as an active listener and take advantage of this opportunity to hear from our leaders and experts who are here to ask questions of them. And we want to ensure that we are creating relevant and impactful program content that appreciate sharing your time with us. And so before I introduce our panelists, I do want to take an opportunity to just kind of share some opening remarks. Obviously, as we reflect back on 2020, we saw the impacts of the COVID-19 on the rare disease genetic community was absolutely unresounding. And we saw genetic testing was significantly impacted. The rise of COVID-19 cases led to a global healthcare shift where resources toward COVID-19 care were impacting the patients with rare disease. And according to an international study, rare disease patients seem to have the worst experience than chronic disease patients due to the pandemic. 60% of patients had experienced interruptions in care, 80% canceled or postponed their appointments, and the inability to access care is expected to make the diagnosis of potential rare disease ever more difficult. The pandemic also exposed some of the longstanding challenges that we've had in the clinical development process. However, there were a few key lessons learned. And the first lesson learned for us is this notion of acceptance. The industry saw that we cannot change a problem until you acknowledge that there is a problem. And so all change and all transformation must start with one, acknowledging and recognition and acceptance. And so we saw our industry accept a need for change with developing numerous possibilities to continue the clinical development process. We saw and experienced many challenges to access the treatment for patients with rare disease, not only treatments, but medical supplies and devices. We saw that like never before, the pandemic brought the topic of clinical trials to the forefront of the general population. Never before have we been exposed to the daily news and the live stream media discussing clinical trials and the therapies in the trials for COVID-19 and the need for data to support the efficacy and safety of these therapies. Furthermore, we saw that one of the large companies, when Moderna briefly halted its vaccine trial to ensure that data from a broad, diverse community was included. Did we truly understand and appreciate the impact of diversity in clinical trials? And then last, but certainly not least, we saw a lesson that I was really proud to see is our industry's ability to adapt. We often learn that sometimes your greatest ability is your ability to adapt. And so we witnessed our industry adapt to and unresolved some of the challenges in the clinical development process. And we saw regulators, including the FDA and the EMA, were quickly to respond and make it safe for clinical trial sponsors and sites to adjust to new methodologies and embrace technology like never before to continue the continuation of clinical development process. And so are these changes permanently? We don't know. We hope that there's no turning back, but we're really excited with my panel and I to talk about some of these advances, much in which we hope will stay, that will provide a more patient-centric, a more flexible solution to really continue to spur on the innovation in medical innovation and scientific improvements for patients with rare and complex diseases. So now please allow me to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sadat Fadi. She is the Associate Director of Clinical Development at Ovid Therapeutics. Dr. Sadat has 15 years of career in research and clinical development. She has a PhD in cancer biology and has an MBA in pharmaceutical management and has completed training in immuno-oncology and vaccine development at the National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute, and vaccine branches. Sadat has spent her career in translational research, community-based and public healthcare research within academia. She spent her time with global drug developers across multiple therapeutic areas within the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. Her work as a private research organization and such as companies such as Schering-Plough, now Merck, Pfizer, Sage Therapeutics. Sadat is passionate about proving health outcomes for patients and has successfully contributed to the design and implementation and rigorous evaluation of several clinical trials. Her keen focus on improving access and high quality and equitable clinical research for patients, minority patients, and underserved communities, and reducing the burden of chronic and rare disease on vulnerable and underserved communities is unresounding. The critical unmet and needs of those patients has really motivated her to involve collaborations in enabling technology and innovation as a means to increase diversity in clinical trials. So I'm excited to have Sadat join us on our panel today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Weinstein, who is the Vice President of Clinical Development at Passage Bio. From his graduation from Harvard Medical School, Dr. Weinstein has completed a residency, chief residency, and a fellowship in pediatric endocrinology at Boston Children's Hospital. He subsequently attained a master's in clinical investigation from Harvard and MIT and became the director of the Glycogen Storage Disease Program at Boston Children's and the University of Florida, the University of Connecticut, and Connecticut's Children's Medical School. After a stellar 30-year career in academic world, Dr. Weinstein has left academic world to this summer of 2020 to pursue join enrolled in industry with Passage Bio as the Vice President of Clinical Development, running their gene therapy trials for GM1 glycosidosis. And so Dr. Weinstein is a highly accomplished and highly decorated physician scientist with multiple awards, including honored with the Order of Smile International Humanitarian Award, and is also a member of the Rare Disease Hall of Fame, and as also a two-time Global Genes Champion of Hope nominee. So I'm very delighted to lead off into our discussions today to talk about the advancements in clinical trials for patients with rare diseases. So first, let me begin with posing the first question to Sadat. Can you take an opportunity to talk about, from your role with leading biotech companies, what you've seen in some of the changes and advancements in clinical trials for patients with rare diseases?
I'm happy to take that question, Arquez, and thanks to you and the panel. It's great to be here with you, with David today. Many thanks to Global Genes as well, and all of the sponsors for putting on this event. Just to sort of target, and we're glad everybody could join us today. Getting to your question around adaptive trials and sort of how the industry has really evolved around this time. And I love the fact that you kind of touched on that in your opening statement. As a result of COVID, we've seen, I would say, the most impressive uptick in adaptability and change. And there's definitely an appetite to look for new ways to think outside the box in order to meet critical needs of patients when it comes to the rare disease community. I love the fact that we're talking about adaptive trials. We hear this all the time. What does that mean? So when you talk about adaptive trials, you're really looking at ways to meet some of the challenges that we find with traditional or conventional randomized controlled trials. We know from experience that these trials can face challenges when doing rare disease because you're working with a much smaller population. It is the ability to, by design, really have a responsive approach to doing research. And so there is an element of utilizing data, utilizing interim analysis to be able to make changes in either aspects of the design, statistical aspects after the trial has started, so after the onset of the study. And all of this is sort of pre-laid out beforehand. We've come up with terms like master protocol, for example, that really allows you to ask multiple questions, I would say myriads of questions beyond just safety and efficacy. So it really is a way to adapt. And I think this is really the way in which research is going. We've seen a lot of evidence within oncology that it is an approach that works. Yet there are still challenges with being able to translate that approach to rare disease. There's several kinds of adaptive trials, and I'd love to get into a little bit more detail in that maybe further down in our conversation. But it gives you the ability to test multiple treatments, in the same trial. We refer to those as platform trials. It allows us to sort of look at subsets of patient populations within the same study. And it allows us to make quick decisions based on data that we're seeing, whether to drop certain treatments due to futility, to progress another treatment, to add a patient cohort, and allows us to look at other elements within the trial, such as biomarkers, specific aspects, including patient-reported outcomes, that can really give indicative insight into the risk-benefit profile of the investigative drug. So it's really essential, and it's something that I think is going to continue to evolve.
Thank you for that, Sadat. David, can you take a little time to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've experienced with rare disease clinical trials?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Arquez, for the introduction, and thank you, Global Genes. I'm very fortunate. I was able to have the experience of being on both sides of this to really understand some of the challenges, and there are unique challenges when it comes to rare disease research. Doing a study in a rare disease population is not like doing a study on a statin or looking at a mental health drug that's where it's large populations. And I hope that over this session, we'll be able to expand on some of these challenges. So the first thing is that there are challenges just because of the relationship that exists between the rare disease patients and the physicians. And we can talk more about it, but the relationship, that bond is very different than the traditional patient-doctor relationship. Patients are oftentimes with the rare disease physicians for a long period of time. They're very closely connected. The interactions are, people typically are on cell phones, and that leads to a gray area when it comes to these trials, because patients think that they trust their doctors, and they believe that doctors would never do a trial unless they felt that this was going to benefit them. But oftentimes we just don't know when we're doing these trials. But it also can impact the physicians. The physicians get so close to the patients that it can be difficult to separate out what's good for a trial. And we can talk about ways we've overcome this. But let me give you an example. For a fatal disease, like you mentioned, I'm doing GM1 gangliosidosis, and that's a devastating disorder where children they decline very rapidly, and physicians can get put in a situation knowing that a patient may not be the optimal patient for a study because they've already started to decline, but they also know without the treatment that the patient has no hope. And how do physicians deal with it? There are more challenges also related to for the sponsors. Finding the right outcome measure is very challenging with rare diseases, and we can talk more about that if there's interest. How do you find the right sites for rare disease studies? I think this is one of the mistakes that happens frequently in rare disease research, is that people get put in trials who don't have experience with rare diseases. They may be experts in gene therapy, or they may be an expert geneticist, but they may not have expertise in that particular rare disease, and that can affect studies. And you've already mentioned, Sadat, some of the challenges when dealing with the regulatory agencies and how we can't do the classic traditional double-blind study and how we deal with it. So I hope we will continue to expand on these challenges and go into more detail. I also want to just say, Arquez, you mentioned the diversity in the Moderna trial. And so I think, I know you're passionate about this. It's absolutely critical when it comes to these studies.
Thank you, David. You touched on a really good point, and I do want to take an opportunity to go a little bit deeper. Can you talk a little bit about focusing on relevant endpoints and really bringing in the patients and their family into those discussions? Can you share some best practices on how sponsors as well as investigators as patients can find relevant endpoints, whether that's relevant endpoints and relevant assessments? Talk a little bit about your experience there.
So I think the endpoints are very difficult because the rare disease literature oftentimes is not, there are limited articles because there are small populations. People oftentimes publish case reports and don't have large populations to do studies. And as a result, this can lead to challenges. So let me give an example from my former life when I was doing glycogen storage disease work. The literature reported that 70% of patients with glycogen storage disease develop hepatic adenomas, liver tumors. And so one of the companies that was interested in glycogen storage disease trials saw that and made their primary outcome measure hepatic adenoma prevention. But the field had advanced. So from 1998 till the time I left, we went from a disease that was almost universally fatal, or where patients got liver transplants, to one where people were doing very well, but the literature hadn't caught up with the advances. And so the outcome measure was wrong because by the time the study was being done, less than 5% of people were developing adenoma. So it made the study fail because the wrong outcome measure was chosen. And I think this is a recurring problem in rare diseases that the literature does not always reflect the state of the field because the patients are spread out so much.
Outstanding. And David, do you mind take an opportunity to talk a little bit about the role of natural history studies in patient registries?
So, yeah, for rare diseases is critical. As aforementioned, we cannot do a double-blind study, partly because it's not ethical. If we have a rare disease in children that's fatal, I think it's unethical to do a placebo-controlled trial, and I think most people in the field agree with that. So how can we do this if we can't do a placebo-controlled trial? And usually in a rare disease, we're forced to try to compare to natural history data. We struggle, though, because there are not good databases for rare diseases. Another problem that has been a recurrent issue in rare disease research is that sometimes there are multiple companies interested in a condition, but they're all competing to do natural history studies. And I have seen this over and over again where there'll be multiple companies trying to do a natural history study to support an individual study, but because everybody's doing natural history studies, nobody can do it successfully. And we have to get the regulatory agencies to appreciate that for rare diseases, natural history comparisons are relevant and critical to use. We also need to get industry to understand that there's an opportunity for companies to work together in rare diseases to collect natural history data so that we're not getting to the point where nobody succeeds because everybody's competing.
Outstanding. Thank you, David. So that's a great point to talk about, industry working together. Obviously, we saw this manifest itself into obviously being able to accelerate the development for vaccines. Can you talk a little bit about what you have experienced with the role of data sharing and collaboration across the industry to advance rare disease research?
Sure. I mean, David, you make a key point. You see me nodding my head here. It's critical. And I think that we can approach this from a couple of different ways. Arquez, to your question about how we're sort of looking at this from an industry perspective. I mean, going back to the earlier topics around, being adaptive, there's been a lot of support across industry. I'm, thrilled to see that, FDA has also created an environment for us to start being, more concerted in the way that we're tackling these issues. We talk about complex innovative design, for example, and FDA's effort to create this 5-year pilot program that allows you to approach the agency, get feedback on design, et cetera. In terms of how this can be tackled and sort of how you look at this, it kind of goes back to what I had mentioned earlier about the different types of trials you can do. One thing that I'll say is really interesting, and there was a paper published on this in Orphanet's Journal of Rare Disease about 2 years ago that did a qualitative analysis on patient perspectives around these sort of adaptive trials, et cetera. And they found that that was a key issue that, and it depends on the age of onset as well. You find that parents with younger children who may have rare disease really have high expectations. And this might be the only opportunity in a disease where there's no approved therapy to get treatment. And so no one wants to be randomized to a placebo arm. Ways around that, really looking at, some of the designs that I had referenced earlier. If you're able to do more of a master protocol design, where you have, even a basket trial, where you're looking at different indications that might have similar underlying pathology, you then reduce either the size of the placebo arm, or you can use a single placebo arm as a comparator across all of those different groups. So it's a much streamlined approach to your traditional trial, where each of those would have been separate studies with its own individual placebo arm. Aside from that, we talk about some of the challenges with, randomized, controlled, double-blind. And I think, David, you had alluded to this point at some point in terms of the fact that within rare disease community, there's always a lot of communication and interaction. And that can introduce some bias and sort of, affect the adequacy of blinding within these trials. And so, when you talk about being on a placebo arm and a patient being able to figure out and how that might impact outcomes, again, we look at ways to be better transparent, with patients, with caregivers, with parents, as they're enrolling into these trials, really trying to understand. And as you said, we need to be relying more on a lot of these natural history, doing real world evidence to leverage our understanding within these disease areas. And it really boils down to, again, looking at ways that we as industry can work together. We should be contributing to building more robust patient registries where we can get longitudinal data, long-term data that can, better inform design. We should be engaging with the rare disease community. When I say community, we're talking about patients, we're talking about families. We should be interacting with them early on, even before we start developing these protocols to really understand, what are the endpoints, what are the aspects that are going to be clinically meaningful to these patients on the trial. And, lastly, I'll just say, the open label extension, I mean, traditionally, these have been your quote unquote phase 3 trials that go on for extended periods. But we've seen modification of this, right after your phase 2 or as you advance into pivotal, it's important to have your open label extensions that patients can roll over into. I think, as industry, we need to be mindful about how we're designing those trials and making sure that the inclusion-exclusion criteria there doesn't inadvertently exclude patients who've completed treatments and ought to be able to roll over. And lastly, I'll say that, finding ways, again, to sort of reduce the size of these placebo arms, create more opportunities for patients to get treatment, looking at crossover designs where patients who start off on placebo arm have the opportunity to cross over to treatment.
Outstanding, great insight, Sadat. You touched on this sense of community. Obviously, we know that the rare disease community, there is a very strong sense of community, and that sense of community can certainly provide some advantages and disadvantages. And so, David, talk a little bit about some of the, surprises that you've experienced with, rare disease and associated with some of the strong sense of community.
So both of you, Sadat and Arquez, are making a critical point, which I don't think most people in industry understand, which is how close the rare disease community is. This family organizations are critical for rare diseases, and families can talk, they share their experience. They also are some of the most knowledgeable people. I think the parents know more than most of the physicians and most of the people in industry. So one issue I'll just bring up is that when I was doing basic science research, trying to bring gene therapy for glycogen storage disease to patients, I worked with the families to do this. So there was no industry support. And for the first 12 years of the work, it was all paid for with by the families. And so they knew what was going on. And so they're following the work and they get very invested. When we finally get into clinical trials, everybody in the community knows what's happening. So when we dosed our first patient with glycogen storage disease, the whole community was aware that this was happening. They knew the day it was happening because the patient had shared that experience. So there was no secret, even though the company and the investigators weren't talking about it. We had a big surprise. You mentioned a surprise because this was such a big deal for the glycogen storage disease community that they wanted to share in the experience. So without any of the investigation team knowing or the company, the patient put cameras in the room where we were doing the infusion and broadcast it live on Facebook Live. And we found out afterward that over 5,000 people around the world were watching this infusion of gene therapy without our knowledge. And this is an example of the field has not caught up with technology. Social media is out there. Another surprise from another trial is that every detail of our trial, every lab result, every event that was occurring was being shared in a family blog that was being updated every day or every week by the families. And I don't think industry realizes how close the community is. So I could keep going on with lots of examples, but I think people need to realize that it is a community and they share information.
And certainly a part of that, the ability to share information is the proliferation of technology and integrated technology. We've certainly seen this with obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly around decentralized clinical trial approaches. Obviously, my organization works very closely with sponsors to provide a more patient-centric solution. And really what we saw is that the adoption of telemedicine, the adoption of e-consent solutions essentially moved our industry forward. It is believed to be somewhere between 8 to 10 years in terms of what we were able to do in terms of accelerating us forward. And so what that does is promote a flexibility, and flexibility is the new currency for as we think about how we advance the clinical development. We need to think about designing flexibility into our trials. And so Doc, can you talk a little bit about in terms of what you believe in terms of what is the carry forward? What does this mean in terms of flexibility is the new currency for developing clinical trials and reducing some of the complexity in the protocol design?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a vital area to focus on at this point. And David, to the point that you were making earlier around social media, I think that's a perfect example, right? So how, as investigators in the scientific community, do we begin to embrace these avenues of technology and begin to think more innovatively in terms of, how we reach out to our communities, how we're engaging with families. David, I think you were spot on when you said that a lot of the families have educated themselves to the point that they know more than some of the physicians and some of us, at these companies. And so, as we're thinking around this, I think first and foremost, it's about engagement and empowerment. Our modus operandi is, when we're designing trials, we want to get insights from the experts, from the leaders in the field. And so we engage with our KOLs. I think we're at a point, particularly within the rare disease community, we should also be interacting with our families, with patients, with parents and caregivers just as early. Because we need to know their experience. We need to understand their patient journey. We've just spent some time talking around natural history and real world evidence and how this is sort of transforming, how we're approaching the space within clinical development. The patient journey, even thinking sort of from a health economics perspective, is vital. And the best way to get that is from the source. And I think that should be channeled directly into the way that we're designing these trials, the way that we think about recruitment. You were spot on, Arquez, when you talked about some of the challenges that we faced aside from COVID. We're at a point where, the rare disease community is highly burdened. It's a very small community. We define rare disease as fewer than 200,000 within the US. I think it's 1 in 2,000 in Europe. We know that there are between 5,000 to 7,000 rare diseases. It is a community. honestly, worldwide. And when you look at specific indications, especially ultra rare and orphan, it's the same group of patients that are being overburdened. And so, how do we begin to reduce those burdens? I think technology plays a key role. Um, One of the things that I think has been so indicative, I've been enamored, talking to patients, is the use of technology. Particularly within the epilepsy space, particularly within, some of these broader neurodegenerative spectrum disorders as well. We struggle, David, as you mentioned earlier, with endpoints. And so, trying to find validated scales and instruments that sort of cut across some of the underlying and really touch on aspects that translate to clinically meaningfulness can be a challenge. And we need to rely more now on patient-reported outcomes. And how do we leverage that with technology? I go back to the case of epilepsy. I mean, imagine being able to track frequency of seizures and how difficult it is. A lot of patients have embraced the ability to do video monitoring. Some families have embraced electronic diaries. And so again, we have wearable technology as well that can also continue to collect data in real time as you're sleeping, as you're, doing your normal daily routine. I mean, that's real world, outcomes. And I think we can begin to utilize that in a much more efficient way, and embrace flexibility within our trials, again, by helping to increase access. It's interesting, David, you can probably attest to this very broadly, the amount of distance that patients travel, even just to get to sites, particularly rare disease, some, crossing state boundaries just to get to the site. And so the more that we can look at, bringing the trial direct to patients, that opens up the opportunity to really begin to understand the disease at a fundamental level that I would say we really haven't been able to get at our specific designated site visits, right? There's so much that happens in between visits that we're not capturing by just following the traditional model.
Outstanding. And I'm looking at the actual, the questions that we have from the attendees. We've got some great questions here. With a few minutes, we want to take opportunity to see if we can answer a few of these questions. And so one of the questions would be, would you please discuss the real world data that researchers have found most useful in registries and natural history studies? There's actually a two-part question here around natural history is first steps to collaborations to run a natural history study. Can either David or Sadati, you want to kind of try to tackle that question for the attendees?
I'll start just because it's a topic that I'm very interested in. I think when designing natural history studies, one of the key factors is also to involve families, because we have to make sure that when we're collecting the information, we have all the information that's going to be needed for the future. So there have been many natural history studies where they focus on survival as what they're trying to gather. But for families, especially with rare diseases, survival may not be the outcome that they're most critical with. We've heard for some of the disorders that I've dealt with that they don't want a child to, just to survive with no quality of life. They want to see improvement or interactions or quality of life issues. And we have to make sure that those natural history studies are capturing everything that we're going to eventually need for the interventional trial, whether it's developmental outcome measures or quality of life issues. So I think it's important to make sure that we capture that before we design the natural history studies. I think we have to go into natural history studies aiming for institutions to collaborate. So in my old life, we started at one point where every institution or every major center had its own natural history study, but that doesn't end up helping the field as much. And then thanks to, I will give him Peter Smith from Groningen in the Netherlands, he brought all the sites together to create a database that ultimately was critical, so that people from 21 countries were feeding into this database, which ended up being really helpful when we did our trials. So I think the message is work with the patients to create it, and then institutions, just like I was saying earlier, industry needs to work together, institutions need to work together, and we all have to work as one team to make sure that we have a good comparison group. Sadat.
Oh, excellent points, David. I'll just add a little bit to that to say, totally agree with you. I think we also need to be thinking about, how we're collecting this data. We have access to electronic health record. We have access to other elements that can be incorporated. How are we thinking around technology? A lot of companies now are developing algorithms, deep machine learning that can help sort of integrate, a lot of these different data sources and come up with some predictive analysis based on patient data that's being gathered. I'll add as well, getting to the point of collaboration, I think there is an appetite. We're seeing a lot of consortiums popping up within the rare disease space with the sole goal of sharing data. We've seen this successful across the, other platform trials. AstraZeneca did this with ALS. There's a lot of work being done within hemophilia, of course, the rare, neurological disorders as well. And so I think that's an area that we really need to start focusing on in terms of how can industry collaborate more across developing more robust patient registries that will house a lot of this natural history data that can be used as comparators on a lot of our studies.
And if you don't mind me following up, I know, Sadat, this is also something you're very interested in. As we're doing these natural history databases and registries, we need to make sure that we capture diversity. Because one of the major problems that we have had, that I have seen in rare disease research, is that we get a subset of the population. We will get people from North America or an isolated community, and this leads to data that can cause problems in trials. So let me give one example. I was doing glycogen storage disease work on the Faroe Islands, but there was a founder mutation there, and everybody had the same phenotype, but that phenotype may have been different than the rest of the world because they had a milder mutation. And if we only capture one community, we're not really getting the true flavor that is needed for these natural history studies.
I'm so glad you raised the point, David. I think, there's a lot of work to be done. We understand the impact, and there are dire impacts to having underrepresentation within our data sets and trials that do not reflect worldwide population. And so really being able to target a lot of this within minority populations, I think speaks to even broadening the way that we tackle, trials, both within the US and ex-US. And so there's a whole continent and continents that, we're leaving out of the sphere when we're looking at targeting global trials. We should be exploring opportunities, building capacity within Africa, where we're looking at Asia, the Middle East, to be able to, again, ensure that we have representative data across all ethnic groups.
Outstanding. And I think it's good to see that the FDA recognizes this issue and has released guidance, draft guidance back in June of 19 around enhancing diversity in clinical trials. And so absolutely, very, very, our nation, the world is really centered around this, obviously being a very meaningful opportunity for us to respond. I do want to take an opportunity to present one more question from the actual attendees. It says, what will it take for institutions in pharma industry companies to work together on rare disease, having the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, is one of the questions that was presented. So Sadat or David?
Yeah, I'd love to take this. I mean, I think, again, if within the rare disease community, we need to start taking more lessons from oncology. We've been able to collaborate more broadly. And I think there are a lot of elements of that that we can translate over to the rare disease community. I think there are lots of incentives to do that. Number one, it gets us to our goal quicker. It saves on costs. It reduces a lot of the challenge and complexity from some of this. And so the sooner that we can start to collaborate across indication within these therapeutic areas, I think it will really open up the door to more meaningful outcomes for patients within the community.
Thank you, Sadat. There is one additional question. Says, what is it possible for foundations to create an international natural history study without obtaining ethnic or IRB approval in each country? Anybody has any experience with that or comment?
Because I actually lost the last part of your audio. So I think the question was referring to international
Yes.
natural history. Could you repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, the international natural history study without having to obtain ethnic or IRB approval in each country.
Well, I can start by using, Africa as an example for this. There is a lot of effort to actually centralize a lot of the regulatory authority to be able to do just that. There's a lot of work ongoing right now in countries like Ghana, Rwanda, where there are active efforts to build patient registries, not only for natural history, but even for trials. So the same way that we have clinicaltrials.gov, there's already been a robust trial registry to be able to track this data. So I think with that centralization and standardization of a lot of the regulatory body, it will open up opportunities for international collaboration where it's not on a country by country basis, but you can look at this more as a regional effort. And David, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Because I'm not a regulatory specialist, I don't really want to, I'm not sure I want to get into the IRB issues across country lines because it can get a little tricky there. But I think one of the things we can do is get organizations to work together. And I would like to put a plug in to try to empower the family organizations for that are joining this, and Global Genes and all the organizations that represent rare disease. The organizations are very powerful. And you, as a group, must mandate that academic institutions work together. I think it's something that we did in the glycogen storage disease field, because you can't have people competing for patients, not working together, duplicating effort. There's not enough money to go around to do lots of the same studies in rare diseases. And as organizations, I hope that you can put pressure on industry. You can put pressure on academic institutions to do things together like natural history studies so that this can get done. And I think the key there is going to be the family organizations.
Outstanding. Again, guys, this is great comments. Thank you both, David and Sadat, for your great insights. As we head to the next session, please take a few moments to respond to the polls that are being launched now. We appreciate your feedback on the session. We want to ensure that we're able to provide great content and programming for the rare disease community. We also encourage you to share your feedback at events@globalgene.org. Up next, please join us for the poster hall to visit the posters, chat with researchers, and learn more about some of the exciting research projects underway. Please join us again this afternoon for a plenary session on endpoints and advances in new therapeutic approaches. Again, thank you for your time.